a misunderstanding of what it could look like for Christians to love your neighbor and love your enemy versus not liking what they did.
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent one. I'll tell you, I totally understand when someone says, I hate Nazis or I hate the 9/11. I totally understand that. That is just you don't need to be a Christian to hate Nazis. It's just, there's just this innate loathing of people that in some way appear to be extra evil or wicked. And that's totally natural. So if I'm actually going to love my neighbor, I'm going to need, I told God, I need divine intervention here. I cannot do this on, it's not happening if I have to make myself sort of love the neighbor. And it has to do with two things. A, I don't think we can on our own. And B, we have a warped sense of what love is. It means to feel fond of the person. But Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I don't feel fond of myself. In fact, of all the people in the world here, I'm probably most often disappointed in myself, not my neighbor. I don't feel fond of myself, but I do care about the direction I'm going. I do care about mistakes that I have made that, wow, there was terrible consequences to that. I grieve about the things that I've done that were mistakes and they led to pain and suffering. And I also hope that I do better in the future. I want to be heading in the right direction. I care about where I'm going. And this is the kind of love that C.S. Lewis talks about when he says, what is it that Jesus talked about when he says, love your neighbor? He says, you want to be grieved by the mistakes they have made, and you want to care about and have compassion for them, no matter how heinous they might be. And you want to actually care about the possibility that they could be salvaged, they could be changed and so forth, but never does it include endorsing what they did. And it also can totally include loathing horrible things that they had done. So for example, on the news one evening I was watching it, and they announced about some school bus driver who had done something that was so, I'd never even heard of such a thing. It was actually make you want to lose your supper as you're eating it. It was horrible. And what I noticed is that I felt a deep sense of grief and sorrow as I listened to this news. I thought, that's not me. That's not me. That's got to be God. That's changing me to grieve over this person who is so lost that they would even know about doing things like this. That is horrific. Here's a person created in the image of God, and they have done something that's so disgusting, I almost lost my supper. And I felt grief. In the old days, my natural response is wipe that person right off the face of the planet. We don't need people like this. We don't need them. No, there is a time for arresting people, bringing them to trial and serving justice and preventing them from harming others. There's definitely a place for that. If that's not done, that's a violation of justice. And we should legitimately become disturbed when we see violations of justice, either in a violation of justice simply be doing nothing, letting the person get away scot-free. Or it could be people being accused and convicted of things they never actually did. Those things should make us angry.
And as a Christian, when I see evil happening because of humanity, I know why they're doing that. And so regardless of whether they call themselves a Christian, an atheist, whatever, it doesn't matter at that point. When they're doing evil, that's a sign that they are totally not following what God wants them to follow. And so society's versions of morals, Christianity's versions of morals, a lot of it lines up. There's a reason for that, I think. But we know when something's going wrong. But I also know that other parts of the world where they may not have that same morality, they don't see it as wrong. North Korea does not see some of the stuff they're doing is wrong because they've lost their they don't have the same morals. Now, we can get into why they may not see it themselves as wrong anymore in a different episode. But when I see evil happening, their conscience is seared. There's verses in the Bible that say your conscience goes through steps where at some point it's gone.
Yeah. Searing
and
of
it
the conscience.
requires a miracle to come back.
Yeah. A divine intervention to come back. Even in North Korea, I think people can be subjugated.
Mhm.
They can be beaten down, subjugated, and essentially brainwashed by propaganda that's relentless and never ending to then begin to embrace things that are wrong and evil. The other thing that I think corrupts human nature is too much power.
Power.
And you see that kind of power even in the case of some of the atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine, in
Mhm.
Bucha, for example, where a person is in a position of absolute power, an individual soldier or a group, and they can do whatever they want. They can just shoot somebody in the back, and that made the news here last week. They just killed some people completely with no motivation whatsoever, or they can rape women or whatever. And you see that that's human nature. And the interesting thing is I used to think I would never do stuff like that. That was back about almost 40 years ago. And I heard a guy say there's no limit to how low a person will stoop given the right circumstances. And I didn't believe it at the time. But as I worked in different countries around the world and saw atrocities and I saw things that I can't even talk about, I I realized that if I had been raised in their shoes, I probably would have been doing those things. Like if I had been raised in the shoes of some of those guys in Bucha, I hate to say this, but I cannot legitimately say that I would not have done the same thing if I had been raised in their shoes. And so, what is the common denominator we have as human beings? It's human nature. Now, that God never intended you to die the way you were born. So we're all born with the natural way we are, human nature. And what God's intention is to bring us through a process of refinement through this life so that we end this life vastly better than the way we started, vastly changed. And unfortunately, our culture today, it really believes that the way you are naturally born with your natural desires or whatever, that's what needs to be. You need to stay that way. And it's wrong to try and convince you that there should be any growth or any change that occurs in the course of a person's life. But that was never God's intention. And I have lost all faith in humanity.